So today's session is all focused around self-esteem. So one of the things that I was very conscious of was that lots of our new members that have joined, excuse me, when I was asking them what they would like to learn about, there was a real theme coming up around self-esteem. So I really wanted to spend some time talking about that and exploring that, and hopefully giving some practical tips on what you can do if you are struggling with a child who has lower self-esteem, or perhaps you just want to invest in them so that you can help them build greater self-esteem in the future. So that's what we're going to talk about today. The first thing I want to do is really kind of define what self-esteem is and what self-esteem isn't, because I think that often these terms are used not necessarily inappropriately, but kind of interchangeably, which I think can confuse things. So I thought we'd start with a session around what self-esteem is, what some of the symptoms are of low self-esteem and also of high self-esteem, so you kind of know what to look for, and then get into some really practical steps and tips that you could think about for building self-esteem if you feel that that's what your child needs, or if it's just something that you want to invest in for the future. So this isn't just about if your child has low self-esteem, although we will talk about that. It's also about preventative ways in which, excuse me, in which you can be doing things to help your child develop positive self-esteem or sustain that positive self-esteem. So as always, there is a cheat sheet available for this session. I know that I sometimes talk quite quickly and go through things, and it's just always nice to have a bit of a cheat sheet that you can print out and spend some time going through. So the link to that is in the session, and I'll also post the link to it in the comments at the end as well. So definitely worth downloading that, just so you've got a bit of a reference and a bit of a summary of those 6 steps that I'm going to talk about towards the end of the session. So who have we got joining? I can see we've got some people joining us. It'd be great if you could just give me a thumbs up or a little wave to say hi. Let me know who you are and where you're joining from. I'd love to see you. And whilst you're doing that, I'm just going to pour some water, because I've definitely got a frog in my throat today. So I'm going to use that as an excuse to pour some water. So I'd love to know who's joining me live. I know loads of people end up watching these sessions afterwards. Hey Sharon, how are you doing? Nice to see you. I know lots of people end up watching the sessions afterwards because this time doesn't work for everybody, and it's really hard to find a time that does, but hopefully for those of you that hear it works, and if not, if you're watching the replay, then you're very welcome as well. Oh, sound has gone off. That's strange, but good to know. Can you hear me now? Is anyone else having problems with sound? Could you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me, and let me know that you are all good with sound? I can't see a reason why the sound would have gone off. Joe, any better now? Can you hear me now? If someone could give me a thumbs up to let me know you can hear me, that would be great. Anne-Marie, hey Anne-Marie, thanks for joining us. Can you hear me, Anne-Marie? I'm worrying that the sound's gone off because Joe said she can't hear anything. Hey Sharon, I know you've just joined the family. I'm so excited. And you can hear me. Okay, great. So Joe, I don't know whether it's a problem on your end. Oh, you're giving me a thumbs up. We are good to go. I always get nervous when the technology doesn't work out. Okay, brilliant. Well, it's great to have those of you that are here live with us. As I say, for those of you watching the replay, nice to have you here too. Okay, so let's dive into this week's session, which is all focused around building self-esteem in children. We're going to start off by running through a definition of what self-esteem is and what it isn't. We're going to look at what high self-esteem and low self-esteem might look like, so how those things might manifest. And then we're also going to go through 6 different tips or strategies that I have for you to build self-esteem in your children, or to kind of proactively be thinking about ways to enhance self-esteem. So this session isn't just necessarily for those who are either working with or parenting children with low self-esteem, although it's going to help with that. It might also be really useful, or I hope it will be really useful, for those of you whose kids don't have low self-esteem, but you just want to make sure that you're doing everything that you can to help them, which I know lots of people in the group are. So that's our very rough agenda for the session. There's a link to the freebie in the description, so if you want to download a bit of a cheat sheet afterwards, then you can do that as well. Okay, so let's start off then with a bit of a definition or an explanation around self-esteem. And I know that most of you in this group will know this, but I think it's really important just to be clear what we're talking about before we dive into the session, because self-esteem is one of those words that gets kind of thrown around quite a lot. It's often confused with self-confidence as well. So self-esteem, in terms of how I'm going to be talking about it today, is really all around self-worth, or the kind of the worth upon which a person defines themselves. So the extent to which somebody likes themselves, feels proud of themselves, and believes in themselves. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about self-esteem. And the reason I'm making that distinction is that often people confuse, as I mentioned, self-confidence with self-esteem. But in my experience, often those people who are very outwardly self-confident don't always have high self-esteem. So I think we sometimes get those two things mixed up, and we assume that if somebody is outwardly very confident, then they therefore have self-esteem, when in fact that's not always the case. So often people who present as being very self-confident don't have high self-esteem. Often they do, but as many times as they do, I think often they don't, and it's almost a mask or a perception they want to put out into the world, but inside that's not reflected. So that's why I'm making that distinction between self-confidence, or how somebody might portray you from the outside, and self-esteem, which is very much the internal assessment that you make of yourself. So somebody with low self-esteem then may feel like they're not good at anything, they're hard to love, they don't believe in themselves, they feel like they can't achieve anything. And they don't really see why anyone else would want to love them or want to spend time with them. They're some of the things that characterize low self-esteem. And somebody with high self-esteem, in contrast to that, is somebody who is very proud of themselves. They really have a strong sense of self-belief. So they believe that they can do anything that they put their mind to, and they believe that they are entitled to or deserving of other people's love and attention. So they're the kind of the two extremes of low self-esteem and high self-esteem. And of course, they are very, I'm giving you very intentionally kind of contrasting examples. There will be people, as with any of these things, and children all along that spectrum, that don't necessarily exhibit all of those things, but might see elements of those things feeling like they're true. So I'm just going to pause for a second and see whether that resonates. And I know that we've got a combination of parents in here, and also somebody who runs a nursery who uses My Happy Mind, and others. So I'd love to hear whether you have experience of those types of symptoms when it comes to self-esteem, and what you see as the key things that manifest really when you have a child in particular with low self-esteem. So feel free to jump in on the comments with your thoughts and feedback on that as I go through. Now, there's lots and lots of research, as you can imagine, out there around self-esteem and what you can do to build it, and what you can do to really enhance a child's self-esteem. But before we go into some of that and we look at some of the strategies that have been proven to work, I wanted just to talk a bit about where self-esteem comes from. So what is it that creates either high self-esteem or low self-esteem? And the reality is that a child's self-esteem, or a person's self-esteem, comes from a variety of different sources. So it comes from how they're parented, it comes from their teachers, how they're kind of spoken to in their school environment, and it also comes from others that they spend time with. So our self-esteem is very much built up based upon the external influences that we hear and that we're subject to, and how they make us feel about ourselves. Okay, so our self-esteem, as I said at the start, is very much our own definition of ourself and how we feel about ourselves, but that is heavily impacted by those that we spend our time with, including parents, teachers, and others. So the kind of the internal dialogue that we have with ourselves about our self-worth, which is essentially what self-esteem is very much influenced by the external conversations or influences that we have around us. And so one of the things that's really useful to do and to think about when you're thinking about a child's self-esteem, particularly if it's a child that you parent, is what are those influences around them, and are they positive influences or not? And that can be quite hard to work through, but it's certainly something that's worth thinking about, because at the end of the day, our self-esteem is to a large extent, not exclusively, but to a large extent impacted by those influences that we have around us. And the language that we hear around ourselves very much influences how we then see ourselves. So that's something to definitely just have in your mind. So let's jump in, and I'm looking over here because I've got my cheat sheet that you're going to download after in front of me. But we're going to look at kind of some of the anchors around self-esteem, and I use the word anchors because these are things that if you can help create the environment for in a child's life, having these anchors there, then you're going to positively impact their self-esteem. As with any of this stuff, these aren't quick fixes. They're not something that you can just, turn on and expect everything to be okay. The self-esteem is something that's going to take time to build. But if you can have these anchors in a child's life as much as possible, then you are definitely going to positively impact their self-esteem. And the other thing to say is that the reason I've called them anchors is that these are things that almost the child needs to be accountable for. And of course, we can help them with that. But over time, they need to come from within the child. And that's why I call them anchors, because they really need to be anchored within the child themselves over time. And of course, that's a bit of a process to get there. But hopefully that word makes sense to you. So the first one is celebrating who you are, not what you do. Okay, so for those of you that have been following My Happy Mind for a while, you will have heard me talk about this dichotomy that I think is a real issue in education around us focusing solely on competence rather than character. So one of the things that we know from positive psychology, which I spoke about last week, is that if you are well aware of and feel secure in your character strengths, so who you are at your core, then you will have a much greater sense of self-esteem than if you're not. So we know from scientific study after scientific study that when we know what our character strengths are and we feel good about our character strengths, we are happier. Okay, so that is just scientifically factual. It's been proven with all sorts of brain scans and other things that when we know what our character strengths are and we feel good about our character, we feel happier. The challenge with this is that most schools, and I'm sure there are amazing schools and nurseries that are the exception to this, but most schools and most kind of social constructs focus on our competence, not our character. So if you think about a primary school, for example, the things that children are rewarded for are doing a good piece of writing or doing well in a maths test. We're teaching children to aspire to get 10 out of 10. We're teaching children to finish the work in the allotted time. And all of those things are reinforcing a child's competence, whether they're good at something or less good at something. And inherent within that is a sense of always comparing yourself to somebody else, because competence, within it implies that there's always going to be somebody better than you and somebody less good than you. And so if children are constantly comparing themselves against others, then that's not necessarily great for their self-esteem. Now, there's nothing wrong with aspiring to do well in school and getting good grades, and that's all fine. But what I'm saying is, if that's all a child is focused on, and they don't have that strong sense of who they are and their character, then it's harder to build their self-esteem, because in any given situation, they're going to be thinking about what their friend's done who may have done better than them. Whereas if they have a strong sense of character alongside that, let's say a child knows that one of their character strengths is that they're really, really kind, they can focus on that all of the time and nobody can ever take that strength away from them. So helping a child to feel good about their character and not just their competence is a really, really positive way to build self-esteem. Now, for those of you that are in the group that are not signed up for my free webinars this week, definitely sign up, because I go into more detail about this whole character space. I can put a link to the sessions in the comments later on, but I'm talking a lot about character in those sessions, both tomorrow and Wednesday. So sign up if you haven't. So that's the first one, celebrating who you are, not what you do. So that's that real focus on character rather than competence. And it's really interesting when you start to reflect on yourself as a parent. And I've been through this journey. I used to reward my children or praise my children more so based on their competence, so how they had done, than I did on their character, the way they had done it. And actually, when you start to evaluate your own language as a parent, doesn't mean you're a bad parent. It just means that you may be using the language that your parents use with you. And guess what? Their parents used it with them before then. And so some of this is about looking at your own habits and maybe thinking about, is there ways I could adjust them? So I did used to focus on what mark did you get on the spelling test? And now I focus on, how well do you feel you did? Do you feel like you put the work in? Well done for trying so hard, and well done for being determined to learn those tricky spellings this week. And it's a very, very subtle shift, but once you get into the habit of it, you'll find that it becomes second nature. So that's number one, celebrating who you are, not what you do. Okay, the second anchor that I want to talk about is setting meaningful goals for the child. And really, this is about helping the child to get to a place where they set meaningful goals for themselves. So what I'm talking about here is helping a child to find their sense of purpose and their sense of joy in the world. Because so often we are not focused on those things. So often we're focused on a child doing the things that we think they should do, whether that's tidying their room or doing their homework. But if you can get a child to set meaningful goals that they want to achieve, and then they are encouraged to work toward them by you, as opposed to having the goals set by you, so again, a simple distinction, then you're going to be teaching them those skills of resilience. And one of the things that is most powerful in teaching, or building, I should say, a child's self-esteem is them learning and achieving things. So most parents are amazing at giving their children praise, so praising them for when they've done something. And most parents also, and I've been here as well as a parent, are too quick to help their child when they're struggling. I don't know if anyone can relate to that that's on with me live, but our tendency as parents, because we care about our children and we love them, is that when we see them struggling, we want to jump in and help them. And actually, when it comes to self-esteem, often the best thing that we can do when our child is struggling is let them struggle and let them figure it out and let them learn from that. Because the self-esteem that a child gets when they've figured something out, particularly when it was a struggle, is huge. And then you praise the fact that they were determined and they were resilient in sorting that out. Now, this one's tricky for parents because we will want to jump in. You know, if there's a child who's struggling to move, even just to move an object in a playroom, the tendency is to jump in and try and do it for them, but let them do it, let them figure it out. Because what that does is allows them to have that internal dialogue that we talked about right at the start of, hey, I was able to achieve that. It was tricky, but I did it. And that gives them self-worth, which in turn builds their self-esteem. So setting meaningful goals for them and letting them struggle a bit, letting them have tricky moments and letting them work through that, supporting them along the way, of course, but resist the temptation, which we all do, to jump in and help them before they've had that real opportunity to try and figure it out for themselves. So I hope that makes sense. Give me a thumbs up if this is all making sense and you're still with me from a sound perspective as well. Okay, the third anchor that is really, really important is all around setting meaningful goals for yourself, but also, sorry, we've just talked about that one. I'm distracted because somebody's pinging me on the other thing, so I need to turn that off. So the third one is spending time with people who lift you up. Okay, so, and again, we talked a bit about this last week in terms of positive relationships. So if your child is spending time with friends or family members or whoever it might be that don't make them feel good about themselves, guess what? Their self-esteem is going to be negatively impacted. If, on the other hand, they're spending time with friends, family members, etc., who make them feel great about themselves and make them feel worthy and make them feel loved, then their self-esteem is going to increase. So again, self-esteem is really about the internal dialogue that we have with ourselves around our self-worth. So if a child has 2 or 3 friends, let's say, who are incredibly competitive and spend a lot of their time kind of making fun of, or even if it's in a good-natured way, drawing attention to your child's inability to do something, or the fact that your child is less competent at something than they might be, that is not good for their self-esteem, because that's creating an internal dialogue for that child, which is, even my friends think I'm no good at that, which isn't healthy for them. Now, of course, we can't protect our children all of the time from these influences, but what we can do as parents is be aware of and help our children to see that actually some of those friendships might not be the most positive friendships. And we can also have conversations with our family members to say, it's really important, if you are trying to build your child's self-esteem at the moment, that you focus on making my child feel loved, feel wanted, and feel supported. And so if you do have a child that is struggling with self-esteem, which I know many of you do, because you've told me in the group, then having a conversation with family members that they spend a lot of time with, and almost giving them a bit of a tip off that it would be really helpful if you could, say these types of things to my child or support my child in this way. And that's a really positive way to start a child's self-dialogue changing to be one that's more positive. So really just try and work on helping them to identify those positive relationships and spend less time with those relationships that perhaps aren't helping them to feel good about who they are. Okay, number 4 is live in the moment. Now, I know that sounds a bit cheesy, but bear with me on this one. So we know that often children or adults who have lower self-esteem can tend to get lost in things. So they can tend to just want to put the TV on and disengage from the world, or they can tend to want to play a video game for too long. And one of the reasons that they do that is that it's an escape from the world and they don't have to face that internal dialogue that they're having, which might not be a positive one. And so one of the things that you can really do to help a child who has low self-esteem is really encourage them to be very present and very conscious in everything they're doing. So an example might be, if you're having a family meal after their day at school, making sure that in that conversation they are very actively engaged. So if that means talking to them about something that is a particular interest of theirs, then great. What we don't want is for the child to be sat there kind of in their own world, or on their phone at the dinner table, or whatever it might be. So finding ways for the child to live very consciously and be very present in everything that they're doing is really, really great for their self-esteem. Because when they are in a positive conversation with you about their day or about a topic or whatever it might be, what they are learning from that is that you want to hear from them, that their opinion is valued, and that gives them self-worth. Whereas if you are letting them sit in front of the TV for 3 hours a night, because that feels like the easier option, then what's actually going on as a dialogue in their mind is, there's nobody that wants to talk to me, nobody's really engaging with me, and therefore that has a negative impact on their view of their self-worth. Now, again, I'm exaggerating to make a point. My son plays on his PS4 frequently, so this is not me saying turn off all TVs, turn off all game consoles. It's about balance. There's nothing wrong with them doing those things in a balanced way. But if you are trying to build self-esteem, helping your child to live in the moment and to be very present with activities that they're doing is a really, really helpful way to do that. And again, this stuff takes time. So this isn't a case of having one conversation at dinner and it's all going to be okay. This is about building in these anchors as a way of life so that you can really help your child to build that self-esteem. Okay, the 5th one is helping your child to have the confidence to stick to their guns. I'm just going to take a little sip of my water. Just give me a second. So what I mean by this is helping your child to develop a really strong sense of what they believe in and what they think is right and what they think is wrong, and to stand up for themselves. Children who who do this tend to have higher self-esteem because they are staying true to what they believe in, which converts into a dialogue around it's okay for me to have my views and to stand by them. Because what's going to happen when they do that is that people will respect them. Whereas if your child is somebody that just goes with the crowd the whole time and never really stands up for themselves, then again, that dialogue around self-worth is not as strong because they don't feel like they have their own opinions and they don't feel like they can stand up for themselves. So teaching your child through very, very simple things that it's right to have a view and to stand up for that view is really, really positive for their self-esteem, because it helps them to see that what they think matters and that if they make a certain choice, that's okay. And you can introduce this in a really simple way, just in terms of in the home. So you could, be having a conversation about what you want to do that weekend, and you could throw in a couple of options, and you could see which one your child wants to go for. So you just encouraging them to have a view and to stand by that view is incredibly powerful for their self-esteem, particularly as they get older, because we all want our children to stand up for themselves and to stand up for what they believe in, as opposed to being overly influenced by people and potentially not in a good way. So having those conversations about what do you think? What would you do in this situation? I often have conversations with my children around current affairs. So we recently talked about, this was a funny conversation with a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old about the Donald Trump balloon that went all over London. You guys must have seen that, right? The hot air balloon with Donald Trump and a mobile phone and his nappy. Anyone else see that? Give me a thumbs up if you saw it. I'm sure you probably did. But we spoke about as a family whether that was right or not. And it was interesting. My 5-year-old said, I think that's making fun of him. And even if people don't like him, you shouldn't make fun of someone. And I thought, that's brilliant, because she's standing up for what she believes in. And I told her she's absolutely right. If that's what you think, then you should say you don't agree with it. My 9-year-old, who has a particular obsession with Donald Trump, was less convinced that it was a bad thing to do, but that was okay too. That was his opinion. So the point is, through very everyday kind of current affairs, things that are happening in the world or in your life or in their lives, you can ask your child what their opinion is. And then you can validate that their opinion matters and their opinion counts. And in doing that as a parent, you're starting to build that sense of, yeah, what I think matters, what I think counts. My view is worthy, which again, in turn, then builds their self-esteem. Okay, so that's stick to your guns. And the final one, number 6, is all about rewriting the negative talk. So often children with self-esteem are having quite a negative internal dialogue. So the conversation that they are having with themselves is along the lines of, I'm not worthy, or I'm not good enough, or I can't do this, or people don't want to be my friend. And if you can work towards getting your child to share some of what they're feeling and then reframing some of that with them and for them, then that's really, really positive. And this one can be tricky if children are not at the point of wanting to talk about it. You can encourage them to journal, you can encourage them to draw pictures, you can encourage them to talk about it. I find that bedtime is a great time to have these conversations. I know that can be hard as a parent because you're kind of tired at the end of the day and you want to just get through bedtime and go downstairs and have a glass of wine or whatever else it might be. But I find that my kids tell me the most about how they're feeling just before bedtime. I don't know whether it's something about them having relaxed and calming down for the day, but that tends to be a really good time. So if you do have a child who has low self-esteem, you will start to pick up, if they will talk to you, what some of that self-talk is. So for example, the child might not say, I don't feel worthy, or nobody cares about my opinion. But what they might say is, we were playing a game today in the playground and no one would follow my rules. Everyone thought my game was rubbish. Well, that's a signal. That's a signal that they are telling themselves a story that they weren't worthy or that their opinion didn't matter in that situation. And so whilst they're not going to probably tell you the exact negative self-talk, you will be able to pick up through what they're saying that they're having those feelings. And what you can do then is help them reframe that. So with the example of the child in the playground not wanting to follow their rules, you could say something like, well, how did you share those rules? And they might say, well, I just kind of muttered them under my breath. And so you could say, well, maybe next time you could try suggesting them in a different way. Or you could say, well, maybe they were just so excited about playing the game that they didn't hear your rules. Or, there's lots of different ways that you can reframe that for the child. But the key is you're going to have to listen out for the ways in which they're speaking and sharing with you so that you can help them to reframe that. And looking at things from a different perspective is always a great way to help children start to shift that negative self-talk. Because it's like anything, we get into really bad habits around the stories that we tell ourselves. And the trouble is, if we keep telling ourselves the same stories, we start to believe them to be true. And so the more you can kind of intercept or challenge those thought patterns that your children are having, then the greater impact you'll have on building their self-esteem. So hopefully that makes sense. So I'm just going to quickly recap on all of the 6 anchors that we've spoken about. But again, they are all in the free download, the link to which is in the description of the Facebook Live. So you can download that and have a record of them. So the first was celebrating who you are and not what you do. So this was that whole conversation around character versus competence. The second was setting meaningful goals and helping your children to persevere and be resilient, resisting that urge to jump in and save them when they're struggling. Step 3 was making sure that they're spending time with people that are going to lift them up, not pull them down. Number 4 was all about living in the moment, so living very consciously. Number 5, sticking to your guns, so helping children to see and feel that their opinion matters and that people want to hear it. And then number 6 was around rewriting some of that negative talk that many of us have going around in our brains. But hopefully that was a useful session. It's great to have you with me. For those of you that have been on live, do let me have your feedback, what you want more of, less of, so that I can make sure that these regular Monday sessions are giving you what you need. And I will look forward to next week's session. So have a great Monday and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.